Hi, in this presentation on Follower by Seamus Heaney, we will consider the key themes and ideas in the poem, explore language in detail, study how precise meaning is crafted in the literary language, notice how attitudes and emotional impact are crafted by Heaney, reflect on the use of memory to shape significant emotions, and deconstruct and understand the nature of the narrative recounting. Finally, we'll consider the creation of poetic voice and viewpoint. Look at these pictures from Edward Steichen's famous exhibition of the family of man from 1955. The pictures explore ideas about fathers and sons. In what ways do sons follow in their father's footsteps? Is this process the same as it's always been? And what might change this? Think about those things for a few moments and jot down your thoughts. After the Second World War, the new Labour government expanded secondary schooling and offered funding for grammar schools and university places. Seamus Heaney immediately benefited from this. The Education Reform Act of 1944 had led to those free places, and education and success meant social mobility. Heaney passed his 11 plus in 1950 and gained a place at St Columb's College, Derry. He was destined for a more academic career, and when he returned home at breaks, he was allowed to sleep in while his brothers had to go out and work on the farm. In Dennis O'Driscoll's Stepping Stones, Heaney admits he was teased by locals about how much his father actually did plough the land, or he says he never knew if his father even read the poem Follower, which is primarily about their relationship. With encouragement from his godmother, his Aunt Sally, Heaney read the classics and he aspired to more intellectual pursuits. The poem we are going to study focuses on ploughing. In many parts of Ireland and the UK in the 1940s, some farm work was still completed by farm labourers and horses. Quickly after the war, however, tractors and mechanisation improved the use of the land. This then created a nostalgic view for traditional farming methods, which is still celebrated today in many county fairs, and there are nostalgic ornaments around the countryside in rural pubs. Watch one of the YouTube links suggested here. One is on traditional Irish farming, and the other is on the use and practice of using a horse-plough. What skills do you see to admire in these traditional ploughing methods? In these pictures, you can see traditional 19th century farm labouring, digging the potato crop and then harvesting with a horse. By the 1950s, many farmers had tractors to improve farming yields. By the mid-1950s, combine harvesters were a common sight in rural areas. Even if individual farmers couldn't afford to buy one themselves, they would often team up and hire them, so that they were seen throughout the countryside. Now let's turn our attention to Seamus Heaney's poem, Follower.
Follower. My father worked with a horse-plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the headrig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hob-nailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away.
When Patrick and Margaret Heaney were married, they moved into Mossbourne and lived with his sister Mary. But when the Uncle Hugh died, the Woods farm became available, and he moved there with his young family. He was a respected local manager of the 40-acre farm and a busy cattle trader too, so he was often away from home trading. If you look back at the title, Heaney uses the word follower without any article, which means it is more of a generic epithet, more open to interpretation. In the poem, Heaney's father follows in his father's and family's footsteps by living off the land. He literally follows the horse and plough in the poem too. The younger Seamus in the narrative follows his father, slipping on the mud. And he even wanted to grow up and plough, and had the intentions of following in that tradition. But looking back as a poet, the mature Heaney is critical, and was literally and metaphorically in his father's shadow as a boy. He could not compete. And then by the end of the poem, this has changed. The focus shifts so that Heaney's father, as an older man, is aged and infirm. He is now dependent on his son. He follows him and stumbles behind Heaney himself. The status of each man has changed. So if we think about the key ideas and themes of the poem, we can summarize them as follows. Youth. Heaney recalls his idealism as a child. Tradition. Heaney acknowledges his heritage and his break with that past. Memory. The narrative is told by recounting the memory of the things from the past, of what he did as a child, and how that has impacted his life, especially his alternative life as a poet. Fathers. The importance of his father is seen, and how that role has changed. Respect. The way in which a child respects and matures into an alternative view of their parents as they get older. Status. How aging and maturity alter relationships, alter the self-perception of a child becoming a man. And loss. Heaney seems to acknowledge his lost childhood innocence of the dream he had once, and whilst his father may annoy and frustrate him in his latter years, there is a nostalgic sense of loss for the man his father was. Patrick Heaney died in October 1986. His loss was called an unroofing by Heaney, who was at the time teaching at Harvard and then on a sabbatical. Marie Heaney would outlive Seamus Heaney and die in 2013. Her descendants continue to run the Woods farm today and have a successful brewery business. Heaney Irish Stout is available from the Wood, Bellaghy. If you look at the pronouns in the poem, you'll see that it begins with the first person possessive pronoun, which makes it an autobiographical view. My father worked. Yet the subject for the first three stanzas is the father, his clicking tongue, he would, his eye, his hobnail wake, he rode, his plod, and his broad shadow. But later in the poem, highlighted in yellow, the mature Heaney switches the focus to himself. with a first-person pronoun in I stumbled, I wanted, I was a nuisance. The change in perspective follows the change of status of the youthful admiration of the child to the annoyance and frustration with an elderly parent who makes demands and is now the nuisance, stumbling and following behind Heaney. A closer look at the language reveals a number of phonological effects. Heaney uses the longer vowels of shoulders, globed, and sail to create a reverence and awe for his father. The childlike view is full of respect as he watches his calm, measured acts between the shafts, the furrow, the horse strained. These acts are calm and skillful, like the vowels. Notice also the metaphor of the globed shoulders that fill out. Heaney's father is a strong, powerful man. His muscles are rounded, and the simile of the fully unfurled sail suggests that power in the natural place. The verb worked, Heaney has said, was chosen as a more erudite standard English form in place of the working class wrought. Heaney said he wanted to avoid a kind of insistent political class correctness, as if he was parading his language otherwise to write "my father wrought with a horse." Notice the regularity of the structure here, with a consistent rhyming in lines 2 and 4 of strung and tongue. And there's often a half rhyme or more on the first or third lines in the poem. This measured, steady structure reflects the order and skill of his father, who can plough and control the horse, just as Heaney ploughs his text and can turn the lines in easy rows. The short vowels of clicking tongue evokes the sound of the father with the onomatopoeic clicking and the harsh plosives of cl and k. If we look at the use of sentence structures across the poem, there are a number of observations to make. There's a regular use of simple statements, with the declaratives listing the significant points from the past. These recount the memory. My father worked. His shoulder globed. He would set. The sod rolled over, and so forth. In the midst of this, at the start of stanza 2, Heaney suddenly uses a noun phrase to simply define his father. An expert. A simple epithet defines the son's adulation for his father's skill and the sense of family pride in that status. This skill is described in the details of the plough with the brightest steel pointed sock, the sod that turns without breaking. The details of this adverbial convey the expertise, as does with a single pluck, the skillful and masterly control of the father who can simply click his tongue or pluck the reins and control the horse. Notice too the consonants of the plosives in cluck and pluck and the brief sounds evoking those sudden actions. As well as the statements to list the skills, Heaney employs regular enjambment as the father steadily ploughs, and Heaney moves and crafts the lines of his poetry to run smoothly with the lines even as his father turned and resumed the ploughing. So you have strung between the shafts, set the wing and fit, and then across stanzas 2 to 3 with a single pluck of reins. It's smooth and fluent, like their skills. The conditional would set conveys his regular and timeless skill, whilst the alliterative of would and wing creates an even greater surety in sound. Similarly, the short vowels and the plosive t's in set and fit are brief, measured and precise, like his father, who does all of this with the calm, measured pace of the longer vowels in bright steel pointed sock, ending on the shorter definitive act of placing the blade in the ground. This is echoed with the assonance of the next line in sock and sod. Equally calmly, it is stated and then rolled over without breaking. These vowels slow the pace to a controlled, easy meter. And finally, the last line begins with the more dynamic actions, with a run of short vowels as he plucks the rein. In this stanza, the rhyming scheme is maintained with round and ground, and whilst there are the clear measured vowels in reins, team, turned, eye, narrow, ground, and furrow, there are a lot more shorter vowels. These suggest the quick skills and the movement of the team, the sweating horse, and back into the land, with the strong assonances on the short vowel a, the a, which is continued in the next line on narrowed and angled at and into the land, and then later on in mapping the furrow exactly. The precision of the father is mirrored in the skill of the poet, so follower is like a metaphor here for the scene who follows his father, but in wordplay, not in ploughing. Now Heaney writes about himself as a child, and in contrast to his father, the son is represented as inept. The verbs stumbled and fell show his inadequacy, struggling behind his father. The metaphor of hob-nailed wake replaces the traditional one of following in his footsteps. Hob-nailed boots were studded steel labourers' boots with hard-wearing soles. The metaphor of the wake also shows the power of his father, who moves through his element, cutting a distinctive path, but it also extends the metaphor of the ship or the sails from stanza 1 to reflect the father's power. When he slips on the polished sod, we see the adjective polished as it is finished, perfected to a clear shine, and evokes the sense of a finisher. The picture here shows a tractor ploughing neat, clean lines. The adverbial sometimes shows the routine and regular nature of the ploughing and the playful relationship that Heaney had with his father. This interplay of the pronouns creates this, and the plosives enhance the evocation of the horse dipping and rising to his plod. In the fifth stanza, Heaney expresses his childhood aspirations with a list of verbs: to grow up, to plough, to close one eye, to stiffen his arm. These reflect his observant nature, the young boy copying his father, inspired to emulate him. However, he contrasts this with the adverbial all I ever did, suggesting he always felt lesser, inadequate, or inferior. He was hidden in his father's broad shadow. The shadow may be literal, but one senses the poet Heaney also wanting to compete as a young man to achieve reputation like his father, and he cannot, on the farm at least. We're clearly told his father dominates. The final stanza continues in this vein, with a self-deprecating use of the epithet nuisance. Heaney feels inadequate, reinforcing it with a triplet of progressive verbs: tripping, falling, yapping. The connotations of this suggest he is little more than a puppy, young, immature, noisy. And then we have the alternating connective but, which creates the volta, the turn of the poem. The emotional impact all hinges on the reversal here, as Heaney becomes a man, skilled, masterful in his use of poetic technique, and he reverses the roles and status of himself and his father. The adverbial today brings the narrative to the present of the poem, as Heaney writes in 1969. He is a 30-year-old man, established and published with a first-class honours degree. He has made his mark and is proud of his accomplishments. He is married with children and is publishing his second collection of poems. He is assured. The final lines seem rather unsympathetic to the father. He now keeps stumbling, and with the juxtaposition of the same epithet, we may also assume that he is tripping, falling, and yapping too. The prepositional phrase behind me places Heaney in the lead, or at the front, and reduces his father now to follower. But Heaney is not leading. There is no relationship here. There is a sad realization that he has passed his father and even wishes to leave him. The final lines, "will not go away," suggest Heaney feels encumbered in his father's presence. They have little in common. They have not lived in the same house for many years. And Heaney sees his father as so much less of the man than he was. So in the loss of his father, there is perhaps some implicit pity, and perhaps guilt or shame too. In the book Stepping Stones, Dennis O'Driscoll asked Heaney whether his father was ambivalent about the educational path that Seamus had embarked on. Heaney says, "It's hard to know about that. There was a strong streak of fatalism in my father. For a start, he didn't talk much about our future, or about anything. The notion that there were options, that a future could be projected, that a change might be effected in the level of operations, I don't think he took that in. He was out on the road earning a living, but in a different way from a wage earner. He would have regarded himself as more lord than labourer. There was a touch of the artist about him, I suppose, a certain pride, a certain freedom that came from being on the road among the cattle people. He would have seen himself endowed with a definite position because of that, different from the neighbours who just farmed the land. To put it another way, he would have been seen dealing as a calling, and he would have known that I hadn't been called. And, this is a wild guess, but maybe there's something in it, he might have unconsciously regarded me as belonging to the woman world of the home, rather than the man world of the road."